more broadly, I think representation can give people the courage to step up and claim their own space and their own identity.
Welcome to the Affirming Practice Podcast. My name is Casey Brimmer. Today we are talking about representation beyond media, representation in everyday life, and what that means, what that looks like. As I said, my name is Casey Brimmer. I hold a PhD in social, political, ethical, and cultural thought, which is a mouthful, a master's in communication studies and master's in gender studies. And today, as always, I am joined by my lovely co-host.
Hi, I'm Bob Irian. I am a pastor serving in central Pennsylvania. I use he, him pronouns. I am a self-described cishet old white dude who also happens to care a lot about communities that help human beings not just survive but thrive, and how we build those kinds of communities, particularly for marginalized people, and how those of us with privilege can use that privilege for good. And that's part of why I'm part of this project and why it's so important to me.
Today, we're talking about representation and what does it look like in everyday life and beyond media. And for me, what that looks like is people being able to bring their full selves into the room. This was my whole dissertation topic, is a pedagogy of the full self, bringing your full self into the room to teach. And sometimes we do that strategically. Sometimes we do that by choosing what we're going to leave at home. But the place that I've seen this most helpful for me has been in the classroom in terms of how I've seen me being representation helpful to others. So being an out queer non-binary trans professor, non-binary lesbian trans professor has, according to my students, made a difference in them learning from me in topics of gender and sexuality studies and trans studies. And being out as disabled has made a difference for them as they navigate higher education while disabled. What would you say representation outside of media looks like to you?
I think for me, it means people having someone in the room that they can relate to, someone who uh, can sort of bridge some of those gaps between our human experience. Like we've become, in some ways, addicted to self-differentiation, I
Explain
think.
that,
And
please.
by that, I just mean like we've become more and more tribal. Like we're breaking down into our little pods of this group over here and that group over there. And I was saying on a TikTok live stream last night that I can remember when if somebody said, "Oh, that's a dangerous area" or "that's a bad area," like what they meant was charitably, they might mean it was a high crime area. Not so charitably, they might mean that, oh, there were lots of black and brown people who lived there. And because, that was one of the ways that racists used to express themselves. Nowadays, it's when somebody says, oh, that's a bad area or a dangerous area, they may be talking about that's an area where I don't feel comfortable or safe walking down the street holding hands with my spouse, right?
Yeah.
Like, and the the boundary lines have gotten harder and ratcheted up and what have you. And so I think representation in a lot of ways is necessary for people to even feel safe engaging. If there's not somebody in this room who looks like they might at least have one thing in common with me, I might not walk into this room, or if I do, I'm going to sit in the back and stay silent. And I say that as a pastor in literally the whitest denomination in America. Um,
Yeah.
a denomination that has for 40 years had the stated goal of becoming at least 10% people of color, and we're still over 97% white. Some of that is about institutional racism, but not all of it. But the lack of people of color makes it really hard for us to partner with people of color, for
Yeah.
instance. And so that idea of representation, you don't know what you don't know. And you can really very quickly enter into an echo chamber.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, representation, when I walk into a space and I'm looking for representation, looking for people like me, it is about that idea of safety and community. And am I able to walk into this space and say, "Hi, my name is Dr. Casey Ann Brimmer, and I use they, them pronouns." And if I can't do that, what ways am I going to engage that feel safe for me, even if they require leaving parts of myself at home?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I do when I'm teaching is like if I'm teaching trans studies, we read trans and gender diverse authors. That's it. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's not going to be cisgender authors in a trans studies class for me.
Right.
But when I'm teaching just gender studies, I try to make sure the representation matches the identity group we're reading about. So if we're reading about Black feminisms, we're reading from Black feminists.
Right.
And that's a small way that I can kind of pass the mic, incorporate representation into my classrooms. And when I'm doing workshops, I'm trying to find that common ground
Mm-hmm.
so that people who are different than me might find some sort of connection with me because representation often translates to connection.
Right. And in my own particular case, it's one of the reasons why I make it clear as often as I can when, particularly when I'm addressing issues of, say, LGBTQIA justice, that I am as I said a moment ago, a self-confessed cishet old white dude, right? I mean, the old and the white part are pretty obvious. The dude part is mostly obvious, but the cishet part, I make it a point to put that out there as a way of sort of like laying down a marker that I don't speak for this community.
Yeah.
I stand with this community, but if you come to me and ask me about the experience of LGBTQIA plus people in a particular place or in this country or whatever, I am going to hand the mic to an LGBTQIA plus person to answer that question. Or I'm going to encourage you, hey, here are some really good places you can find out about that from people who have lived it. Like I've observed it, I've walked with people through it, but I haven't lived it in the same way that other people have.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. Um, I think one of the things that we can do to increase representation, even if we're not part of a group, is to signal like our belief in their equity and in the necessity for their inclusion without tokenizing folks, without being white saviors or abled saviors or insert whatever adjective saviors, because allyship and representation of allyship and accompliship is also important. It also helps show other people how to behave as allies or accomplices,
I
which,
love the idea of accomplices, by the way. That just,
and so for folks who don't know, ally is kind of we support you, we believe in you. Accomplice is more like we stand with you even when the police are throwing things at you, or
right,
even when bigots are being jerks. We're going to stand with you. We are going to be your accomplice in getting things done so that you don't need accomplices anymore is the goal.
right. It's a level of skin in the game. It's a friend of mine once told me, you know what the difference is between involvement and commitment?
No.
In a bacon and eggs breakfast, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. An
Right.
act can be involved, but an accomplice is committed.
Yeah. And I think the first time I started hearing the word accomplice was like at the start of BLM, Black
Mhm.
Lives Matter. we started hearing the term accomplice and what does it
Right.
look like to be a white accomplice during Black Lives Matter protests. And maybe it looks like being on the front lines and standing between police and protesters, for example, particularly protesters of color. Um,
And that word accomplice matters, particularly when you're talking about standing with communities that have literally been criminalized.
yeah,
Um, you know, Black people have literally been criminalized in this country in a multitude of ways over the last 400 years.
yeah, definitely.
Um, LGBTQIA plus people have been criminalized in this country, and some people are trying to go back to that
Yeah,
as we speak. So, it's not just a cutesy, oh, look how edgy we're being. No, it's a there's a there's an element of humor in it, but there's also a very real element of, are you ready to go to jail for this?
yeah, definitely. I wanted to, like, this is one of the topics that we've discussed before, but this is a topic that when we were brainstorming, you were like, hey, can we please do this? And I was wondering if you would share kind of why that is,
Sure.
before I share why I think it's important too.
Sure. So, I mean, the sort of immediate, most concrete nudge in this direction actually came last Saturday. So, we're recording this on July 30th, and on July 25th, you and I co hosted a merch table at Central Pennsylvania Pride Festival in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And you brought your amazing stickers, and at one point in the afternoon, there were a couple of young people, and I'm not going to speculate about their age because they all looked 12 to me, but they were probably like old enough to buy their own beer. Um,
No, I look 12.
oh, okay, so yeah, I don't know how old they were, but they were looking at the stickers and they were looking for something in particular, and it was clear that they weren't seeing it. And you asked one of them what they were looking for, and they said that they were looking for a demi mask sticker, and it was just not one you happened to have with you that day. And but that then sort of prompted a conversation among the two of them and you and me about the importance of representation, and that, you know particularly for communities that have been marginalized even within a larger marginalized community, or communities that have been pushed to the side, or that people don't know even exist, like, representation matters. It matters to have someone acknowledge your existence, and that, you know you're not a figment of your own imagination, so to speak. And I think also, um, more broadly, I think representation can give people the courage to step up and claim their own space and their own identity. For instance, affirming clergy, right? I happen to not be wearing my collar today because, even though it's a work day, the biggest part of my work day today involved painting a wall in a school, and it's not a thing I typically wear my collar for. I sometimes wear my collar when we're recording this, and I sometimes wear my collar to work, and sometimes I just wear like a golf shirt. Oftentimes, when I am engaged in some kind of work that involves being an accomplice, I make it a point to wear my collar for two reasons. One, so that people who have been abused or harmed by religion know that that is not a universal belief. And I'm not in when I do that, I'm not trying to get them to, hey, give religion another chance. I'm trying to, in some small way, atone for the harm that was done and say, you know, just because some jackwagon with a bullhorn said that you're an abomination in the eyes of God, yet they don't have a monopoly on the point of view of all religious people, and they may believe that, but the God that I know doesn't believe that about you, and you don't have to believe that about yourself. The other reason that I think it's important and this is another thing that happened at Pride on Saturday. Um, there was a young affirming clergy person there, right? From my denomination, in fact. And when I saw them go by, they had their collar on. I asked the question, "Hey, what church are you with?" I was, wearing a t-shirt because I was not in my clergy mode. I said, "Hey, what church are you with?" And they told me. And so we started talking about that. And, you know, when I show up wearing my collar as an affirming clergy person at an LGBTQ advocacy event, hopefully that gives other young clergy the permission to take that stance publicly and say, yes, this is part of what it means to be a shepherd of God's people, is to be a shepherd of God's people for LGBTQ people, even when it's scary or hard or dangerous, or it means, we become an accomplice and people are throwing rocks at us, or there's people in our parishes that think we ought to be fired and disbarred or defrocked. No, we're actually being faithful here. And, you know,
Yeah.
just knowing that they're not alone in that can make a difference for them.
Yeah. So part of like the first part of what you said, where that person was looking for the demi mask sticker, right?
Mhm.
I consciously try to make sure lesser represented kind of micro labels are represented in my merchandise.
Yep. And we've talked
'Cause-
about that. You've talked about how important that is to you.
yeah, because I know what it's like to not feel seen. And for a long time, non-binary stickers weren't there. You could get trans stickers, but you couldn't get non-binary. Somehow there's still a lack of bi pride stickers. And I've only got 4 designs out of 100 and something designs, but there's also only so much I can store, right? But to see someone light up when they see themselves represented,
Mm-hmm.
or to like when I asked that person what they were looking for, part of why I asked is because if I didn't have it, I want to be able to have it soon, if not the next time that I do something, right? Um, and for me, as someone who has been hurt by the church, like when I saw you were clergy, I was hesitant, right? And it took time and consistent action for me to start to trust you
Mm-hmm.
as someone who was clergy. And I think part of what that representation specifically means is even if you aren't kind of atoning for other people's jerk behavior, like you sometimes are when you are wearing a clergy collar at like pride events.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you are apologizing for something, if you are trying to show a change in behavior or a change in perspective, when we've talked about this before, it's the difference between apologizing and making amends and actively doing things that are like supportive or actively demonstrating your change in behavior or perspective.
Right.
Um,
And,
Good.
and, um, well, this is another topic that we're going to get to in an upcoming episode of, like, for um, particularly for religious people trying to be allies and trying to be allies to communities that have been harmed by religious people, there's some extra responsibilities that go with that.
Yeah, yeah,
And part of that comes under the heading of representation.
yeah. Part of why we're talking specifically about representation beyond media is because we do see a lot of discussion about representation in media, and we've had those discussions here on the podcast before. But to talk about representation, say for me in the classroom or in educational spaces, in consultation spaces, or online or wherever, to talk about representation beyond media is to talk about the things that we need to see in everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
It was a queer trans pastor at a pride event that helped me kind of get out of church that was telling me I was wrong for being who I am. It was openly queer teachers that kind of helped me feel like I could be who I am in the classroom. Because when I saw, like, in undergrad, I had two professors, Margot and Enrique, both openly queer professors. And I felt safer learning from them.
Mhm.
And B, when I started teaching, I remembered that and I was able to kind of be more open about who I am, even if I was hesitant at first because I was trying to come into myself as a teacher. And this part of why we're talking about representation, at least why I am, is even if you're not actively representing a specific community, like I'm actively representing being a queer trans person when I'm teaching, by actively representing that I affirm who my queer and trans students are, who my non-binary students are, or who my disabled students are, whatever, we are helping make the world feel safer and show possibilities, especially like when we are doing it for older, for like as older people doing it for younger people, right?
Mhm.
And part of that is like LGBT youth and like the representation of affirmation. According to the Trevor Project in 2019, LGBT youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the last year. And we've talked about the statistics kind of broadly before, but our visibility, even just as being affirming people, makes a difference. We know that for LGBT youth, it decreases suicide risks. But for other groups, it may also be doing that. It may also just be helping people feel like it's okay to be you, or like queer adults exist.
Right.
Like for the longest time, I didn't know that.
Hmm.
For the longest time, I didn't know like affirming adults, like people who actively affirmed queer folks existed. Never mind queer affirming adults, right? And so that representation is a step you can take as an ally,
Hmm.
is to be visibly affirming and actively affirming in your spaces.
Right. And I mean, that's part of why I do some of what I do, just in terms of my own, public ministry, because I've heard stories from friends and colleagues who um, have talked about the part of the struggle of growing up in a cis heterosexist society for them was exacerbated or aggravated by the fact that their faith was really, really important to them. And the only voices they were hearing were voices that were telling them that they could not be a person of faith and be who they were learning themselves to be. And so, yeah, I am not an LGBTQIA plus person, but I am a pastor who recognizes LGBTQIA plus people as like created in the image of God and beloved. And so if like this is one little thing that I can do to help that, young 14-year-old, 15-year-old queer kid who is trying to understand who they are, and that being a person of faith is a part of that equation for them, and that like they don't have to make a false choice
Yeah.
between who they understand themselves to be in their gender identity, who they understand themselves to be in their sexual orientation, and who they understand themselves to be as a person of faith. That like those things can all coexist in ways that affirm the fullness and the beauty of who they are as a person, regardless of what some jackwagon with a bullhorn is yelling at them from a street corner.
Yeah. So one of the things I think about when I think about queer representation and being like an out queer person, and this is like in media, but also not. When I was younger, I loved country music. I loved it so hard, but I didn't see myself represented.
Mm.
And Shelley Wright came out, and I was like, well, that makes sense why her music clicked so well.
Well, yeah.
And not only did she come out, but she went full force into a minefield to be out in country music in the United States. And seeing that A gave me like, okay, someone in this in th- in this field of music that I love is like me. But
Mhm.
also it gave me a model a little bit of what I could do to help create more affirming spaces and to use my voice where others may not necessarily have theirs. And this indirectly, me and dropping pens, this indirectly leads to my next bit or next piece, which is in 2019, I read the book Care Work Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinghe. And it was one of the first times I felt seen as a disabled person in my schooling. And I have a quote from the book on page 34 that I think is important because it shows representation matters even when we don't know or refuse to see it as representing us. So she writes, this is for us and by us, and it is also for everyone who thinks of themselves as able bodied and normatively minded, who may not be, who will not always be, who the ghost of the need for care still dances with as deepest fate worse than death fear, as what you want the most, but can't even let yourself speak. And I think back to that pastor at Pride. When I first met him, I wasn't ready to leave the church that was telling me to pray myself straight because I still I still for whatever reason wanted to be loved and affirmed and validated by this community even though that validation wasn't going to come.
Mhm.
And 6 months later when I actually got kicked out of that church and I messaged the pastor from Pride Prom, the impact of the representation wasn't immediate, but it stuck with me. I kept his card. I, in the midst of feeling abandoned and feeling alone, was able to remember that there were others who may have some form of idea or some form of lived example of what I was going through. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. That,
Having
you
feels,
know,
so I'm not sure.
right. And what kept coming to mind for me was so I listen to a lot of audiobooks when I'm working in my shop, and right now I somehow got hooked into the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, which are just like they're fun and weird and like
Mhm.
and on some levels surprisingly deep. And one of the sort of recurring themes in book two, which I just finished, was that it only takes a seed. You know,
Explain.
sometimes we plant a seed today, and we may not see what that seed does, but down the road, that seed might save our lives, or it might save somebody else's life. And certainly there have been times when we've talked about the fact that I am a person in recovery, and I've had occasions where I've carried a meeting into a care facility or into a jail or wherever, as different AA groups do. And 6 months, a year, in one case, 2 years later, a guy who remembered me as that one clergy dude who brought an AA meeting into the county prison when I was an inmate. I think I can find him. And he, reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you tell me how I go about getting into rehab?" And I was like, "I have no freaking clue, but I can help you navigate that. Like, let's find out together, right?"
Yeah.
And sometimes, just that representation of this is a human being who thinks I matter, at a fundamental level, that kind of representation is critical.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I like that. It only takes a seed. So we want to make sure we're giving you all practical steps for inclusion, practical steps for building affirmation, and in this case, increasing representation. And so what we want to encourage you to do is to be who you are, where it's safe to do so. And I mean, sometimes you might do it where it's not necessarily so safe to do so. I know that I have been out and proud in spaces where that was a little bit dangerous, but it felt important. We want you to be openly affirming. That's something you can actively do. And like we said, one openly affirming adult can help reduce the risk of suicide in LGBT youth by 40%.
And being openly affirming, even as a cis het person, might be dangerous, right? Like, I mean, I've had people pray that God would strike me down. I've had people, say out loud in public that, somebody should beat me to death with a baseball bat, you know, that because I'm, leading people to hell by being an affirming member of the clergy. And like, yeah, that's really disturbing. But at the same time, I would really very much rather they be saying that to me than to, some 15, 16-year-old kid who's just trying to figure out who they are, right?
Yeah.
Because like, I'm a grown up. I've been yelled at before by professionals. They are not going to hurt my one remaining feeling. But some young person who's being bombarded with the message that their life doesn't matter, like that kind of comment could push them over the edge. And
Yeah.
one of these days, I'll tell a story about a young person that happened to, that had a profound impact on my life. But yeah, that's and that comes back to where we started about talking about the difference between an ally and an accomplice. And yeah, having some skin in the game, even when especially when it's scary and hard. Because if it's scary and hard for me as a cis het person who's trying to be an ally, how scary and hard is that environment for LGBTQI plus people?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And something that I think about, and I have a particular passion for this, that I'm going to fully admit that not everyone has the same perspective.
Mm-hmm,
Um, but for me, it's throw out the ally flag and rock the progress pride flag, rock the
mm-hmm,
rainbow with us, because it's saying you're not afraid to be mistaken for one of us. You're
mm-hmm,
not afraid to take that heat. The ally flag is has a beautiful concept in some ways, but it also says, I support you, but I'm not one of you.
mm-hmm.
That's how I've read it since I've seen it. I get really hot and angry.
We talked about that.
Yeah. And I recognize that that's not how everyone sees it, right?
Right.
But for me, if I see it, like the worst thing that's going to happen for me to see you rock the rainbow is I might think you're one of us, and that's not a bad thing. Or I might say, oh, that's a really cool person. I wonder if they are an ally. I wonder if they are an accomplice. Do they have skin in the game? Is it them
Mm-hmm.
or is it someone they care about? And so that's a way you can increase representation, even if it's just saying, like, hey, we want LGBT people here, and we're going to represent that they're welcome here through this.
Right. And, you know, and you and I have talked about this several times and in great depth. And this year was the first year that I, you know, actually just put up a pride flag instead of an ally flag. I stuck my ally flag back in the drawer. But, and for me, it was always a matter of, again, maintaining that recognition that I don't speak for this community. And I'm not trying to distance myself from them in any way other than maintaining that sense of humility of I don't speak for LGBTQIA plus people. I will stand with them and I will do everything I can to platform them and hand them the microphone, but I don't get to speak on their behalf, right? And you know, so like and recognizing, you know, from your perspective that that can feel like distancing and you know saying, oh, I'm with you, but I'm not one of you, and so I don't want to be confused for one of you. Like the I'll be honest with you, if you've taken a good look at sort of stereotypical cishet white men in America lately, like the nicest thing somebody could say about me would be that I was part of the community. Like, you know, I don't want to be confused with those other cishet white guys in a lot of cases. And I'm joking here, of course, and broadly stereotyping, but there's so much toxic heterosexual masculinity out there. Like, you know, oh, you think I'm gay? That's so kind of you.
Yeah, I feel that. And I love that we were able to have the conversation too.
Right.
And so I know you want to say something about leaders, and I want to say something before we get there.
Hmm.
And that's we've talked about passing the mic. So if you are asked to speak on behalf of a community you are not a part of, you can pass the mic to someone who is a part of it. Just say, hey, I have this opportunity. Would you like it? Or refer someone asking you to speak to someone who is relevant. Have those answers or be able to give them. But the other thing is signal boosting increases representation drastically. And to
Hmm.
signal boost means to put out the messages of others. So this is going to be a shameless plug of you can signal boost this podcast by sharing it, by sharing our profile, by sharing our accounts, right? And when you signal boost any piece of media, that helps that media get out there,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
Um, and to do it for people whose media you feel makes a difference is incredibly helpful, whether it's ours or someone else's. Like we try to signal boost other people's media,
Hmm.
even if we share it with one friend. That's a signal boost.
Right. And, you know, and you can also, as you are doing that, you're also acknowledging, you know, some humility and owning some humility with respect to your own relationship to the issue and lifting up the voices of the people who have the lived experience. Like the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. Like I that is not an issue that I have direct firsthand experience of. And I can talk about it. I can make social media posts about why this matters and why it's important and say, hey, folks, you need to be paying attention to this. And on one level, that's important because there are people who will hear it from me who might not hear it from somebody else. But it's also important that at the same time, I am lifting up the voices of Indigenous women and girls about this issue. Um, but and that in some ways that idea of, you know, some people will hear things differently from me than from you or differently from you than from me rolls into one of the things that I think is important for us to do in terms of increasing representation is to hold leaders accountable for increasing representation. If you find yourself in a place where, for instance, there's a panel of people discussing an issue and everybody on that panel are old white guys, raise your hand and ask the question, hey, why is everybody that we're hearing from on this topic an old white guy? why aren't we hearing from women on this topic? Why aren't we hearing from people of color on this topic? Why aren't we hearing from LGBTQIA plus people of color or whatever the topic might be? Like, you know, and particularly if you sort of match the vanilla, if it, like people are, if I walk into a room and I say, hey, wait a minute, why is everybody doing the talking an old white guy? Well, as an old white guy, people are going to pay attention to that. Whereas
Yeah.
they might try to blow you off or they might try to ignore a, 17-year-old black high school student off or whatever. They might blow those people off when they ask those questions. If I ask those questions, I'm going to be received and heard in a different way, right? And that's the very definition of privilege. And this is a place where those of us who have privilege can use that privilege for good by
Yeah.
acknowledging it and saying, hey, what the hell, dudes? Like, you know, why is there no representation here? And what are you going to do about it? And you can do that in a very kind of low key, just asking a question way or suggesting, hey, you know, maybe we should ask so and so to be a part of this conversation and, to increase representation. And, as always, please know that I encourage people to keep in their back pocket the nuclear option. If asking a gentle, low key question doesn't get anybody's attention or they're not paying attention to you, by all means, feel free to pull out the sledgehammer and, pound it down on the desk until they listen and say, look, no, we're not going any further with this discussion until the other people who have a stake in this discussion are at the table.
Yeah, and we've had that discussion, like this part of the conversation before a little bit of the people impacted need to be at the table. Anything about us without us is not
That's
for
not
us.
for us. Right.
And something that I think about here is actually the organization Autism Speaks for a very long time was didn't have autistics on its board
Mm-hmm.
and sort of treated autism like it the people who are autistic didn't or shouldn't have a voice in what was happening with our lives and with advocacy about our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it shifted some since then, but there are speaks like Autism Self Advocacy speaks. There are organizations like Autism Self Advocacy Network that are by, for, and about autistics. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you are looking at supporting an organization, do the research. Are the people impacted by that issue the ones making the decisions on that board
Mm-hmm.
or as leaders in that organization? Our other thing you can do to help increase representation, um, again, goes into like represent being an affirming person, and that's intervening when you see harm, or at minimum, checking in with the person who has been harmed. Maybe it's not, for whatever reason, you don't feel comfortable intervening in the situation, but you can at least say, hey, I saw this happen and couldn't or didn't intervene, and I apologize for that, but are you okay? And just having someone check in and ask, are you okay, is helpful.
Mm-hmm. I,
Um,
I I actually kind of lived that out a few weeks ago, and I know we have an episode coming up on interventions, so I'll save that story for then. But yeah.
we do have an episode coming up on bystander intervention and being part of the change. I want to move us into put it into practice, which is two
Mm-hmm.
parts today. And as always, answer in the comments, answer in a video, and we will respond. But the first part is answering the question, what representation have you needed but couldn't find, or do you need but are having trouble finding?
Mm-hmm.
And two, what representation do you want to see on this podcast? Because we want to make sure that we are answering your questions and increasing the representation where we can. As
Mm-hmm.
always, remember there's a link to ask anonymous questions in our bio, or you can DM or comment questions at any time, or DM us and ask us for that link. We're happy to provide it. put it into practice is about helping you put into practice what we're talking about. So here we're asking you to think about representation. The other thing you can do is see what it looks like in your life to increase representation,
Mhm.
um, or to signal boost. I highly encourage you to find a creator whose work resonates with you and going out and signal boosting them. Signal boost them to us so that we can signal boost them to others.
All
We
right.
would love that, please.
Absolutely.
So that is what I have for today. Do you have anything to add before we close out?
Not that I can, I feel like we've covered this one pretty well. And thank you for being willing to take this topic on next, because it really felt like it was a thing that needed to be explored some, because we hear that word representation thrown around a lot, and I know it took a while before I plucked up the courage to ask somebody to tell me more about what that meant for them.
Yeah. I am always willing to talk about representation, and we've sort of crumbed it, crumb pathed it
Mhm.
throughout our episodes so far. And so I think it was perfectly timed to have this conversation today.
Mhm.
This has been an episode of the Affirming Practice podcast, and we are grateful to you for being here. As always, like, follow, share, subscribe, all of the things, because your support helps us continue this work. You are important, you matter, you make a difference. We are glad you are here. We are glad you exist. And take care of yourselves because you're too important not to.
And as always, please, please, please do remember that you are indeed deeply and profoundly loved, not in spite of, but precisely because of who you are.
Bye, friends.